you so much, Nada. Okay, thanks so much, Nada, for the introduction. And Asmarom, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Asmarom is a community organizer with based here in the city, lifelong New York City resident, and he was born in Adwa in Tigray. So I just want to say welcome, Asmarom, marhaba. It's good to have you here with some great and amazing Westchester activists who have always and are never unwilling to show their international solidarity. And certainly this has been an important issue, not only over the last 8 months, but this has been brewing for some years. We'll get into that. But before we start, I just wanted to share my screen and just make sure we're sort of starting from the same place, because things can be a little bit confusing. So let me just share this really quickly. Okay, can folks just give me a thumbs up if they can see my screen? Okay, great. So I won't maximize for now. But anyway, so this is the Horn of Africa. We're looking at Eritrea and Ethiopia highlighted. The Horn of Africa is also comprised of Somalia and Djibouti. You can sometimes extend it as well with Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. But the Tigray region is the northern part of Ethiopia. It has about 6% of the population of Ethiopia. And most people are familiar with Eritrea and Ethiopia because of the wars that happened in the 70s and 80s predominantly, as well as the famine in the 80s, which received a lot of international attention. Between 1998 and 2000, there was also a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And that's why you see highlighted here is Badme. That was like an important strategic location and a flashpoint of the war from 1998 and 2000. Mekelle, which you can see right there, is the capital city of the Tigray region, which is again in the north. Addis Ababa is further to the south. You can see in sort of central southern Ethiopia. It's part of the Oromia region, which we'll show over here. It's actually not the most updated map, but Ethiopia is an incredibly diverse country. It has over 80 ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups, and historically it's seen as, people see it as like a very Christian country because, again, it has a rich history, particularly in terms of Orthodox Christianity, certainly in the Tigray region and as well within Northern Ethiopia. But it actually has, it's actually, the plurality of the country is actually Muslim. And so, again, when we're speaking about Ethiopia, or speaking about any country, it's important not to basically just flatten it or think of it as a monolithic place. It's extremely, extremely diverse. And so some of the regions we'll be talking about today are the Tigray region, which you can see in the top, the Amhara region, which is below, and also the Oromo region. We'll be speaking about the country in general, but again, these are three of the main regions which will come up in conversation today. Asmarom, is there anything you just want to say? Just again, we'll touch on this later, but just broadly, just about the ethnic diversity or ethno-linguistic diversity in the country.
I think that was a good way to capture it. I think we should also acknowledge that many of the ethno-linguistic nationalist groups that live in Ethiopia were violently incorporated into the country.
Yeah.
I think, is that something we're going to touch on, especially when
most definitely? Yes, most definitely.
I need everyone to keep that in mind. This is not just some natural occurrence that many different ethnic groups have been violently incorporated into what is now Ethiopia.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Asmarom, because we'll touch on this later. Really, at part of the conflict that's going on now, and really what's been part of conflict since Ethiopia was first created as a state over 130 years ago, which was thinking about what does state formation look like and what does Ethiopian nationality mean and what does that look like. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that has violently played out over time. Very often you'll hear that Ethiopia is the only African country never to be colonized. Again, we'll touch on that, but it forces us to really reconsider what does colonization mean, what is happening between the internal hegemony between different various groups in the country. And we'll touch on that. The other country they often always say is Liberia was never colonized. But again, if we're familiar with the history of how Liberia was created, again, yes, it wasn't colonized by a European country, but again, there were dynamics between various ethnic groups that still have played a role in current conflict today, certainly in civil war in the 90s. In Eritrea is much smaller than Ethiopia. Ethiopia, Asman, what's Ethiopia at? 130 million? How many people?
I mean, these census figures aren't so accurate, but I think now it's around 110 million.
Okay, got you. So yeah, 110 million, over 80 ethno-linguistic groups. Eritrea is a lot smaller, 5 to 6 million, huge refugee and diasporic population because of war, and they have 9 ethnic groups. But the only reason why I showed that is because some of the terminology can be confusing. So I just want to go over 3 things which we'll be speaking about. Again, Ethiopia has over 80 ethno-linguistic groups, so it's very diverse linguistically. Tigrinya is a language spoken both in Eritrea and Ethiopia. It is the dominant language within Eritrea, spoken by roughly 60-65% of the population. And in Ethiopia, it is the dominant language in the Tigray region. But again, with 80 linguistic groups, there are many other languages throughout the country. Tigray is a language spoken in Eritrea and parts of Sudan. All right, so this is spoken here, right, in sort of Western Eritrea, Sudan. That's called Tigray, not to be confused with Tigray, which is the northernmost region in Ethiopia. Tigray is inhabited by Tigrayans who speak Tigrinya. So again, just it can be very, very confusing, but that's just like a slight, just distinctions that we want to point out before we start. Any questions before we get into it? Just put it in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because that's all I had. Any sort of just questions on that? Okay, cool. Oh, Fatima. Okay, great. Can we also put Fatima on the screen and spotlight her? Hey, what's up, sis?
Hi, Andom. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. So yeah, if you just want to introduce yourself, here we are we're on a virtual Westchester meetup, basically activists here outside of New York City. Great group of folks who are concerned with what's going on in the Horn of Africa. So yeah, just introduce yourself for us.
Okay, thank you for inviting me and for having me on. My name is Fatuma Badasso. I am from Ethiopia. I'm an ethnic Oromo from the Oromia region, which is that center and the largest region within Ethiopia. And Andom invited me today because he said you guys would be discussing the Tigray war and in general, the political crisis within Ethiopia and what the Oromo perspective is on that. So I'm here to share that with you all. And thank you for having me.
Yes, yes. So we're so happy to have you. I think, if we're going from pre-1991, it'll take us too much time to really discuss all of that history. And so just in very, very short, I'll try to do this in 2 to 3 sentences. Asmaron, Fatuma, just like jump in if you want to add anything. But as Asmaron was saying before, it's important to recognize that many of the peoples of Ethiopia, particularly in the southern region, have been violently incorporated into the country. This is something that has been a process over time, since the era of Menelik, who many people may be familiar with because of the famous Battle of Adwa, which is considered, like one of Africa's greatest, colonial victories in repelling the Italian invaders and colonizers. Thinking about this over the span of 70, 80 years, when we're looking at the wars which were fought in response to Haile Selassie and the Derg, now in like the 1960s and 1970s, many peoples within Ethiopia, and at that time, again, I'm Eritrean, the Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. Many peoples within Ethiopia felt that they were not being adequately represented. They felt that they were being violently subjugated, and they felt that they were being repressed. In the case of Eritreans, right, there was a forced Amharization, which is the language of the language of the ethnic group of Haile Selassie, which had dominated much of the politics. there was sort of a forced language and assimilation that was being put on within Eritrea, but also throughout the rest of Ethiopia, which created a lot of grievances amongst the population. So I can distinctly remember my father, when I was growing up, telling me, the reason why many Eritreans went to fight as teenagers, in the 1960s and 70s, was because they felt that this language was being imposed on them, and they weren't able to properly and adequately authenticate themselves with their indigenous culture. Asmarom, Fatuma, like what do you see as sort of if we're thinking to 1960 to 1990? Again, this is a huge survey, but just in short, like what are the grievances that people are feeling towards the Ethiopian state?
I think as Asmarom pointed out, I think the premise is that most of these nations and nationalities and ethno-linguistic groups were violently, very violently, in the case of the Oromo, and the subgroup that I come from, a literal genocide was actually taking place where people were mutilated, women's breasts were cut off, men were lost like their left arms in an attempt to humiliate the whole population into subjugation. So just the foundation of Ethiopia, modern day Ethiopia, was violent. And most of these nations and nationalities have resisted the assimilationist policies that you just mentioned, which deprived people of their identity, their language, their cultural practices, and just criminalized their identities and essentially. So that's where the Eritrean war was about. It came from. That's what the Tigray war is about. That's what the Oromo resistance movement has always been about. And other southern nations and nationalities continue to resist this assimilationist policy. And this assimilationist policy has continued for over 100. I believe it's going towards 140 years now. And these assimilationist policies were actually mandated. They were state policies that in the case of the Oromo, we were historically displaced, even from the Horn region, saying we're invaders. We came from Madagascar and we have no history in the Horn, and we just are people who are culturally, linguistically, physically inferior to the Amara ruling class. And this was explicitly said during the imperial era in the imperial courts, and during the Derg era and their assimilationist policies, and during the imperial era with Oromos actually being denied use of their own lands. And so this is where the resistance come from, and this is what continues to ail Ethiopia, because the questions of the nations and nationalities is about self-governance and about developing their languages and their identities and their culture, and also about self-governance, right? Because the state has always been repressive to these nations and nationalities, and has never been open to discussing the questions, like fundamental questions and their existential questions, because if a group of people are denied the practice and the development of their culture and their language, they can go extinct. And what the different ethno-linguistic groups in Ethiopia are resisting, the majority are resisting, is this existential threat to who they are. And that is what Ethiopia continues to violently repress. And so that's where, the Tigray war comes into question. And that's where, the crimes and, public executions of youth in Oromia are all about. It's about repressing this, very old and persisting question about identity, and about asserting that identity, and also about self-governance and being represented, by people that they choose to be represented by. And so this question is not getting an answer from the state, and the people are not going to stop asking these questions. And so we continue to have these very, very violent responses by the state apparatus.
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd also like to jump in. Well, two things. It is true that the traditional imperial and economic elite were of Amhara background, just to answer the question on the chat. But that doesn't even necessarily mean that, the average Amhara peasant was somehow better off by having Haile Selassie as king. I mean, the poverty and associated with Amhara peasants were pretty bad, although their kind of culture may have been elevated and their language may have been elevated, it didn't really do anything to change their material conditions. And another thing is, we talked about the forceful incorporation of all these different national identities within Ethiopia. It's very, very important for us to also realize that none of this would be possible without external help, especially coming from Western powers. I mean, the only reason Menelik was able to conquer vast swaths of central and southern Ethiopia, whether it was the RC Oromo, whether it was the Walaitas, the Sidamas, only reason he was able to do that was with guns and military assistance from the West. And we've seen that over and over again, external powers coming in to support and maintain Ethiopian imperialism. In the case of Tigray, obviously we see, Eritrean troops being heavily involved. But I think it's something we might cover with Andom, but I hope that answers your question.
There's another question where they says Amhara language imposed on all public schools. It has been like that pre 1991, the EPRDF era. What sets the EPRDF era apart a little bit from the previous Ethiopian regimes is that it attempted to answer some of these questions posed by the nations and nationalities. It's called the nations and nationalities question in the Ethiopian political discourse, is that they allowed different regions to teach in their native languages, but the working language in all of these regions is mostly Amharic, and it is imposed through legal means. And Ethiopia has a parliamentary government.
Yeah, so and thank you for both of those answers, and thanks for the questions that are coming in at the same time. Apologies to people who are in the crowd and hearing a lot of acronyms. It's just like instinctive because there's so many different liberation fronts and political parties. And we honestly don't have time to go through all of them, but just very, very quickly, you heard before some of our panelists speaking about imperial era, and then after the imperial era. Imperial era, we're referring to the time of Haile Selassie. And during that time, there was, some of you may even remember, the Ethiopian student movement came about, challenging some of the things, again, that Fatuma and Asmarom were speaking about, but also as well the feudal land system that existed. In 1974, they then had the Derg, which essentially was a Marxist revolution. I'm putting that in quotes because, again, people will have different definitions of what, how, whatever. That's a different conversation, but I'll just leave that to the side. But it didn't necessarily, they tried to have social reconstruction in the country, but it didn't necessarily challenge the sort of cultural hegemony that was being spoken about throughout. And at the same time, there was also extreme political repression that happened during that time as they tried to consolidate their power further. That leads us to 1991, where the TPLF, which was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, they march into Addis. Eritrea gets its independence, and now we have a sort of new era of the Ethiopian state. So again, in a sort of, in a best summary that you can, what is happening between 1991 and 2018, this sort of TPLF, EPRDF era that's in Ethiopia?
Well, from the Oromo perspective, so when TPLF marched into what we call Finfinne, Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, it was through, they had a coalition of groups, from Eritrea and Oromia and, various liberation front movements, right? They came in and, it was a political opening, kind of like what we saw when the regime change happened with Abiy Ahmed ascending to power in 2018, where, reforms were happening, the political spaces were a little bit open, and, the current constitution that exists today, that was being ratified, it was being discussed amongst different liberation movement leaders. But what TPLF did was they had POWs from the Derg government, and they chose to create kind of, what do you call it? So to represent the various nations and nationalities, but really the majority ethnic groups like the Amhara and the Oromo ethnic groups, they created these proxy governments for these regions, and then lumped the southern nations and nationalities together and called it SNNPR, and created these proxy leaderships. and kind of pushed out like the Oromo Liberation Front. That was also part of the fight against Derg. Most of those leaders were exiled or either arrested and disappeared. And but the constitution that was worked on by members of the Oromo Liberation Front, the Tigray Liberation Front, and various political actors at that time that I don't have names of, that was introduced as the governing constitution for the new coalition that TPLF was at the helm of, which is we call EPRDF, Ethiopian People's, what is it, EPRDF, Ethiopian People's
Revolutionary Democratic Front.
Revolutionary, yeah, something like that. That for that coalition, and that was ratified in 1995, I believe. And since then, TPLF, as I alluded to before, was at the helm of this coalition of groups, and like the OPDO, Oromo People's Democratic Organization, or something like that. We call them OPDOs, who led the Oromia region, didn't really have much say, but they were proxy governments in the Oromia region, and they carried out some of the most repressive and some of the most gross human rights violations on Oromos, to the extent where Ethiopian prisons, where it was said Ethiopian prisons speak Afan Oromo. Like most of the political prisoners in Ethiopia were Afan Oromo speakers, and TPLF was kind of did the repression kind of systematically. If somebody, they tried to exile people who were politically active and loud and who were mobilizing resistance movements, or even youth groups or community building groups and things like that. Organizations that they feared were building resistance within the Oromia region. If that failed, they arrested them or they bought them out. And so the repression on Oromia was heavy. I'm pretty sure the repression on the Somalia region and the Ogaden region, mass atrocities have occurred. And since then, the questions of the nations and nationalities didn't stop, because the repression was still there, although they were allowed to teach in their language and develop their culture to a certain extent. And some of the answers, the answers to their questions were, answered in that way, where their kids can, like in the Oromia region, the youth that we call Aero, who carried out the mass resistance movement that brought Abiy Ahmed to power, were called the Kobe generation, because they were able for the first time to learn in the Kobe letters, which is the Afan Oromo letters. So those youth became very politically conscious, and very self-aware and very self-asserting. And so in that sense, the EPRDF era was better for the questions that the Oromo have asked. But most of the questions that were asked, such as, seeing themselves in the larger Ethiopian political landscape, self-governance, developing their language and having their language become a working language, as they are the ethnic majority in the country. They're the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, but still felt repressed, still felt like their identities were being criminalized, still felt that they were being politically, economically, and socially marginalized by the EPRDF government. And so those questions that were stopped being asked. And the more those questions were asked, the more Oromos got arrested. And then it became a matter of free our political leaders, free our activists, free our journalists, because the media landscape, political landscape started shrinking, as it does in most authoritarian and repressive governments. And so these questions just piled up, and the Oromo protests were, they came about in response to the expansion of Addis Ababa, which is called what we refer to as the master plan, because as you alluded to earlier, in the creation of Ethiopia, land rights have always been at the crux of different movements within Ethiopian political history. And in that, Oromos have felt that they had, especially the Tulama Oromos, which are in the center, which historically are, were inhabitants of what we today call Addis Ababa, were pushed out, and they had to resettle in other parts of Oromia. And so Addis Ababa expanded at, an alarming rate. And when this plan for a 10-year span, I think, came out, that showed that Addis Ababa was further again expanding into surrounding towns and villages, and which will go on to displace hundreds of thousands of Oromo farmers. Students started protesting, and the diaspora got involved. And and we finally started building medias, because Oromos were historically kind of kept out of building their own institutions, and there were no independent medias in Ethiopia, I don't think ever in its history. And so the diaspora started, publicly funded media platforms in which Oromos were able to connect with each other and kind of strategize with each other. And so the diaspora, with the youth movement on the ground, did a lot of work for 4 years and forced a regime change, or at least reforms within the government. But that reform, as we can now see, was pretty much hijacked. And what we have now is a little bit worse than what we did have, and what people were rebelling against. And so the Oromo protests were sustained for 4 to 5 years. Abiy ascended to power in 2018, and since 2018, he has upended the country in an attempt to consolidate power. And he has been brutal against people who have stood up to him, activists, political groups, regions, cities, towns, villages. His response has been, just violence, just no space for even discussion or dialogue, kind of villainizing, demonizing, and othering people who stand up to him, such as, the Oromia region, which he has been at war with since he came to power. So certain regions in Oromia were under military command posts for the past 3 years, and most people didn't talk about it, including most Oromo activists, because they thought, well, this is a transition, and during a transition, things like these happen, and we'll talk through it, and then we'll resolve them. But they just got out of hand. And what we have now is a genocidal war in Tigray, because Tigray also resisted his, power consolidating moves. And here's where we are today, to sum it up, because it's a lot. So.
Yes, thank you. Asmaram, anything you want to add in terms of that 1991 to 2018 period, in addition to the Oromo protests, which again ushered in this sort of new political space in which Abiy came in? Anything else from the 1991-2018 period you want to mention?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about ethnic federalism and the role that it's had on the country. I don't know if you can go to the map that you had earlier. I think that was a pretty good estimation of what ethnic federalism is, and I can explain a little bit. Thank you so much. So if you look at these administrative boundaries, they're delegated on different ethnic groups. So regional states were created in the 1994 Constitution according to which ethnic group predominated which era, or which area rather. And this was done namely, as Fatima mentioned, and also Andom, this was done to sort of help calm down and address the questions of nations and nationalities, because what people really wanted was to administer themselves. And going up until 1991, almost all of the armed groups that helped bring down the Derg regime were seeking self-determination for their own ethno-linguistic group, like the Oromo Liberation Front, like the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and also the Eritrean Liberation Front, which ended up having their own country. So that's how, so these areas are places where each group predominates, and there have been some issues with ethnic federalism, but we have to really be honest in our assessment. And the reason that the Oromo protests happened wasn't for ethnic federalism to dissipate and for different nations and nationalities to lose their power, but it was actually for more self-determination. That's exactly what they were fighting for. And the leader that we have now, and Abiy Ahmed, who kind of wants to roll back that's the great irony of this situation, And does anyone have any questions about ethnic federalism? So in each state, the predominant ethnic group would be able to teach in their own language. They would also have security forces that would help self-govern their own territory. And there have been some issues with ethnic federalism, namely ethnic minorities living in regional states that are not corresponding to what their ethnic group is, but that's something that could be resolved through the Constitution. That's something that can be resolved through dialogue rather than the genocidal war that we're seeing in Tigray right now. See question. Your ethnic group is in your ID card. I don't know about your driver's license, but it is mentioned in your ID card. But this whole formation was formed not to divide the country into different, what some people refer to as Bantustans, but it was actually to address the issues and the desires that many groups within Ethiopia had in terms of self-determination. And there's a lot of evidence showing that if ethnic federalism was not adopted, then Ethiopia would have simply descended into more war and chaos after 1991. And this was just a way to sort of prevent that from happening. And also another important thing to mention, you can leave the map. You don't have to leave the map one. But there was a referendum in 2019, and there was a 10th regional state created. The Sidama people voted overwhelmingly to create their own ethnic regional state, and that just goes to show you that ethnic federalism and federalism in general is one of the issues that actually unites many Ethiopians. Ethnic federalism is not as unpopular as you might hear in the media or read on in different publications. There are significant demographics in the country that oppose ethnic federalism, namely the urban elite and also the Amhara, who believe that their land has been stolen, and they believe that they want to have a more unitary state that we've talked about before. And that's, I mean, if you disagree with ethnic federalism, I'm not saying that that's an out of line view, but you should pursue things constitutionally and democratically, not by force. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Tigray.
If I may add on that, to his point, ethnic federalism was a compromise, right, to keep these nations and nationalities within Ethiopia, because these were existential questions that have persisted for over 100 years. And, the Sidama was added, Walaita was asking the same questions, and Abiy's regime responded by cracking down on every single institution within Walaita, closing down one of the few radio stations that they had, arresting their leaders. So the overwhelming majority of the peoples that Ethiopia is comprised of are for what we call multinational federalism, which most people call ethnic federalism. And, and there are questions of, how do we constitutionally, that is, right, address the questions of minorities that reside within these different regional states. And I think that could have been done because those are all political solutions, and they're constitutional solutions that could have been, answered through constitutional means. But the Ethiopian state consistently and refuses to answer these questions and even allow the questions to be asked, and uses violence to crush these questions and those who ask these questions, right? And there are people who are anti, and this what we're seeing in Ethiopia right now is really about what he just pointed out, is Abiy and his ideological camp, which is the urban elite and Addis and the Amhara elite, who believe that in order to keep Ethiopia together, everybody needs to speak Amharic, and that Amharic language was used as a means to keep Ethiopians together and create this national identity that Emperor Menelik started when he when he saw word expansion, and so in order for Ethiopia to stay together, we need to go back to that assimilationist, unionist ideology. And really what we have seen is that by answering the questions that are posed by these different groups, who will keep asking these questions no matter what, is by addressing the questions that come up as they come up. And with what, the Oromo protests were started to, actually apply the Constitution as it exists, right? To get more, rights, to get more access to, answering the questions that have not been answered, right? And to get more autonomy on their lands, to get more political representation, and to get more, opportunities to self-administer, because they're linked, so many millions are, kept out of the job market because the, working language in that country is only Amharic, right? So these questions that are being posed could have been answered using the current existing constitution. What Abiy and his political base are going for is to repeal this constitution and replace it with a more unionist constitution. And really what this war boiled down to is a future vision for Ethiopia between the federalist camp, which the Oromo, the Tigrans, Sidamas, Walaitas, Somalis, and many nations within Ethiopia would prefer, against the urban elite who feel like they are entitled to imposing their vision on the rest of Ethiopia, because they feel ethnic federalism is balkanizing Ethiopia, which just isn't the case. And so this is just a clash of visions, and it is a clash of visions that is costing, immeasurable human life, and will continue to do so, because most people are, provide commentary and opinions on what is going on. And while, people like me and, I'm sure people in Tigray would appreciate the solidarity, or even people even being aware of it, I think, a nuanced understanding of what this conflict is actually about and what is at stake is more important, I think. And what is at stake really is, it's an existential threat to most peoples. That's how we feel as Oromos. I'm sure that's how Tigrayans feel, which is why they're all fighting back, men, women, children, And so what is actually happening right now is about imposing a very, a fringe and minority ideological vision on the majority of, Ethiopians. And it is a question that has persisted. It is a conflict that has persisted for over 140 years, and it will continue to do so. As my comrade here has alluded to, and this is all, continued because of, foreign intervention and foreign aid to these, authoritarian governments. And what, I would like to see is, more, just informed solidarity, I think, is what I would prefer to see. And I think that's what you guys get out of this talk today. And that, we urge our leadership here, our congressmen and women, and our senators, and, Secretary of State, State Department, they tend to make their foreign policies based on, I guess, their own interests, but still their interests are costing us, our families, and, costing us a lot as, descendants of these regions. And so, I don't know if I've answered your questions, but it really, from everybody here today, what I would ask is, informed solidarity would be great.
And
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, just the question. That I guess is one of the things they're worried about. And we have to be honest. I mean, Eritrea got its independence 30 years ago, and there's still many, many Ethiopians who have not processed that and gotten over that. I mean, you still have Ethiopians saying that the Red Sea is ours, that Eritrea and Ethiopia should be one day. I think, I don't know, we could talk about that a little bit more, but that's just, yeah.
No, yeah. So we have maybe like 20 minutes. I know we started just a little bit late, but sometimes what happens when we have conversations around the Horn of Africa, the more you hear and the more you learn, it just opens up more questions. And so I don't want to do that, even though, again, it's impossible to be able to go over the entirety of this scope with just in 1 hour. But I was thinking now, as we're about to transition into really just focusing how state violence is being weaponized on Tigray specifically, and hopefully people have an understanding about why it's really important to have an overview of the history, even just be able to talk about where we are right now. I wanted to maybe take questions that maybe people had it from the beginning. I saw Laura put some questions around US involvement, as well as those of Gulf states. If folks could just ask questions or put questions in the chat, so as we answer this next section, we can just incorporate those. So you can just put that into the chat. So just as a transition, I know before Fatuma was talking about the solidarity, she almost presented somewhat of a pessimistic vision about how this has been going on for some time. But I want to contrast that with, in 2018, some of you might have heard about Abiy Ahmed, and there seemed to be, at least within the international community, a lot of optimism around this sort of reformist leader brought in by this wave of Oromo protests to now lead the country in a new direction. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, which many people felt conflicted views about. Certainly within Eritrea, the Eritrean community, at least the Eritrean opposition community, felt rather ambivalent about it because he won the Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with Eritrea. But in Eritrea, there's an authoritarian dictatorship, and people are like, okay, are we normalizing this authoritarian dictatorship? And at the same time, the peace, and rather the conflict that had existed between Eritrea and Ethiopia in many ways was not resolved from the peace that Abiy had. It was between the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which had transitioned to the ruling party in Eritrea, known as the PFDJ, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, and the TPLF in Ethiopia, who were then the ruling coalition, but were no longer part of the ruling coalition when Abiy came into power. Sorry, that's acronym soup. I apologize. But really, the ultimate issue is that the peace was not so much a peace that had dealt with the conflict that had happened from 1998 to 2000, even really an ideological conflict from the left around competing Marxist views from the 80s. EPLF had been more sort of like aligned with the Soviet camp, while the TPLF had been aligned with like the Albanian camp when we're looking at like from Marxist-Leninist distinction. But the peace that we saw was really just a unity of the Eritrean ruler and the Eritrean ruling class and the Ethiopian ruling class to, now that we see, fight and come against Tigray and come against the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So I don't see any questions, so I think we'll just roll along with, how did this war happen? Oh, we do have a question. Okay. While you guys can read that, the general question that we want to speak to is, how did this war happen? Why is it happening? What is going on within the Ethiopian state that has really allowed this humanitarian crisis to come to the point right now where even people, throughout the world are hearing about how it's like one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. How do we get to this point? I know Fatuma and Asma, we were speaking before about the competing visions between, again, ethnic federalism and the unitary state. But what is it like also on the ground here? So if we can speak politically and also humanitarian, from the humanitarian aspect, what's actually happening?
So the justification for this entire war was Abiy Ahmed's allegation and insistence that the TPLF attacked a military base in Tigray. And it is true that they did attack, but if we're putting the proper context into everything that happened, you'll see that his story doesn't really align. So on October 31st, we had so the conflict started in the night of November 3rd, right when we were all focused on the Trump and Biden election, and that definitely was not by accident. So on October 31st, we had an official from the Eritrean government say that the TPLF was on its deathbed. And if you look at satellite images, you see Eritrean troops actually amassing around the border between Eritrea and Tigray. On November 1st, Abiy Ahmed calls the Sudanese military leader, and he tells him to secure the border between Sudan and Tigray. The former police commissioner of the Amhara regional state that has been ethnically cleansing Western Tigray and committing a lot of atrocities and invaded Tigray, he said in his book, he's dead now, but he said in his book that they were preparing for war for weeks. So it was very obvious that it wasn't this unprovoked random attack, rather than Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki were planning this assault on Tigray for months now. I mean, they were visiting each other's military bases. There were articles written even months ago saying that Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki has their eyes on Tigray and settling their dispute with Tigray militarily. So if you look at the way that this war is being conducted, this was systematic and this was planned long before the attack on the Northern Command. In terms of the humanitarian situation, I mean, we're witnessing a humanitarian catastrophe that that is the worst in the world right now, I think, or on par with what's going on with Yemen. And this is totally manufactured. I mean, crops have been burned, livestock have been slaughtered, people have had their farming equipment looted, their homes looted. I mean, this is a systematic famine. This is systematically targeting food sources, and this is why so many people are suffering. It's not because it was just a random war, but this was a weapon of war being used to this day. I'll speak a little bit about the run up to the war too. So Abiy Ahmed cancels the 2020 elections that were set to be held in August. He blamed COVID, which isn't really an excuse because COVID is worse in Ethiopia last month than it was in the August of 2020 rather. And they still went ahead with the elections. So he blamed COVID and he canceled elections. And what he also did, and this is very important, he used the time that elections were canceled to target political opposition leaders, especially in Oromia. I mean, Jawar Mohammed was arrested, who was going to run and challenge Abiy Ahmed in the polls. Bekele Girba was arrested, blaming them for unrest that happened after the popular Oromo singer Hachalu Hundessa was killed. Iskender Nigga is also a political opposition leader, not in the Oromo camp, but more in the Ethiopian nationalist camp. He was also arrested. But Tigray said, no, we're going to go ahead with our own regional elections. We'll have the people of Tigray vote for us. And his response was to cut off funding to Tigray and to try to redistribute the funds that would have gone to Tigray through the provincial and the district leaders rather than the Tigray regional government. And this obviously increased tensions even further. And that is how we saw the lead up to the war. And I think Andom or Fatima, you guys can carry on.
I'd just like to add, for people who have been paying attention to Ethiopia for the past 3 years, for some of us, we knew the war with Tigray was just a matter of time, especially as Oromos, because as I said earlier, when Abiy Ahmed came to power, Andom was correct. There was a lot of optimism, even from us. We really thought that this is a historic political opening, for an all-inclusive national dialogue in which all stakeholders will come together and forge a new path for Ethiopia. And, and that was shattered, especially in Oromia, because the opposition groups that were allowed to come back into the country, the journalists, the activists, and political leaders that were allowed to come back into the country were systematically being pushed out of the political scene. In the case of like the OLF, who were brought back from Eritrea because they were operating out of Eritrea. They were brought back and under really questionable circumstances. And their dealings with the government were kind of like the dealings Abiy had with Isaias Afwerki, which were, nobody knew what the details about them. When they did come back, there was an armed insurgency happening in various regions of Oromia, and Abiy Ahmed basically waged wars on those fronts to repel, rebellions in those regions, but also arresting opposition parties, closing political parties' offices, and harassing people, dubbing them Shane, which is a dubious name that they gave to supporters and members of the OLF. And so we saw as time went on that there were a clash of visions happening here, and the Abiy's regime is more interested in continuing Ethiopian state's legacy of just violently repressing these questions, and wasn't really interested in an all-inclusive national dialogue. And so, as Umar has already said most of what needed to be said, that the trajectory that brought us to the Tigray War. And I think one of the, early telltale signs of what's going to happen in Tigray is what happened in Oromia right after the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa. That assassination was used to completely eliminate the political opposition within Oromia and I think generally within Ethiopia. But Tigray was untouchable just because TPLF was, it was a strong opposition, and there was a lot of heavy military artillery in Tigray, and the ENDF had its northernmost command post in Tigray. And so we could tell that TPLF at that time was positioned to be its most formidable opposition. And, Abiy himself said it recently I think in a parliamentary speech where he said TPLF could have avoided this war by just agreeing to join his new political party, the Prosperity Party, when he dismantled the APRDF and created his own political party. And he said, they could have shared power with us at the center if they had just joined the Prosperity Party, and they could have just ruled Tigray if they hadn't went ahead and held the elections that they held. Elections that were, scheduled to be held at that time. And as Maram said, the conditions were actually much better to hold elections back then than they are now. That, Abiy Ahmed held elections, which we call coronations, because there were no opposition that they ran against themselves, especially in Oromia. And so, we knew it was just a matter of time. And, the causes of the war in Tigray, as Maram has laid out, are very dubious and they're very much questionable. And the government continuously tells on itself and, contradicts itself in every turn. And, the humanitarian crisis on the ground and, is daunting. And also what's more daunting, another side to it is it's just the political space is obviously absent of opposition. What exists now was just okay with gang rapes of women. We had feminists basically okaying mass rape of women, and starvation and famine being weaponized against an entire region. And all of this was okayed by the urban elites and most of what exists of the political actors in the country right now. And so this someone asked her here, does ethnic federalism foster ethnic conflict instead of tolerance for different ethnicities? The ethnic federalism has existed for 30 years, and although the questions of minorities still persist, people live together. Students are able to go to different regions and learn, and universities or hold jobs in different regions. So it hadn't until this regime came, and there have been a lot of intercommunal conflicts, which we think are actually orchestrated by state actors, because these people have lived together for over a century, actually for centuries. So there is no credible, basis to say that ethnic federalism actually fosters ethnic conflict, because it really hasn't until Abiy Ahmed came to power. And a lot of the facts and the circumstances around some of these conflicts that are happening now suggest that there's more, that there's a state actor's hand at play there. And so, what we have right now is, a battle of wills, and, Tigray has a history of fighting off, these repressive governments and repressive regimes, and so does Oromia, and so does Ogaden, and so does all of these different nations and nationalities. And what's happening in Tigray cannot be contained to Tigray, just because that's not the nature of wars. And the humanitarian catastrophe, as Maram has said, is probably much more than those of us in the diaspora can even imagine. Because for a long time, a lot of these, mass atrocity crimes were happening in the complete calm blackouts, right? And especially in Oromia, Wallagga region, a lot hasn't been documented. And I think a lot of what is happening in Tigray now, that international medias are able to go and at least, cover some of it, happened in Walaga, and there are no accounts of that because that happened in complete darkness and complete comms blackout. In Tigray right now, in most areas, and complete comms blackout. So a lot of what's happening on the ground are happening in complete comms blackouts. So I don't think we can even measure the extent of the atrocities that are happening on the ground, the extent of the impact of this war on the ground on civilians. And, it doesn't look like as of today, the unilateral ceasefire that was that Abiy Ahmed's regime called when they were losing the battle against the Tigray forces looks like has been repealed now, and they're amassing different regional forces to go fight internal terrorist groups. And so it looks like it's just going to get worse, and I don't see an end in sight, but the international community can play a role, but we haven't seen anything promising from the international community either. So, it's a sad situation we are in right now.
Yes, certainly. And I'll just add a couple of things, and we'll close up around ways that people can get involved, things that they can do as just individual non-Ethiopians living here in the States. It's been extremely depressing to look at this conflict as someone who's Eritrean from the region, just because, as Fatuma was just most recently mentioning, how polarizing and really just disgusting the discourse has been, not only within Ethiopia, but certainly within social media spaces. For many of us, there are former friends who we may have had who we've been shocked to see how they've responded to this war over the last 8 months, which is really a genocidal war. And I think, Asmarom was speaking to the debates about how the war has started, and there have been conflicting sort of accounts about what happened on November 4th. But I think regardless of how the war actually started, what's indisputable is the scale of the humanitarian tragedy that's going on right now. And I think when you look at the humanitarian tragedy and see at the same time the sort of this like Orwellian like doublespeak that's being done by the regime, it really speaks to what Fatuma was saying about it's actually probably worse than we can even imagine. When the war started, Abiy Ahmed said that it would be a quick law and order enforcement operation, but very quickly we saw that this conflict was actually internationalized, where Eritrean government had actually sent in troops into Tigray and has been there for months, right? Close to at least 7 months. Maybe we don't know exactly when they first came in, but at least 7 months. And so the irony of this situation is that, the argument from Abiy's camp is that ethnic federalism is something that is inherently destructive to the nation state of Ethiopia, its sovereignty. And what are they doing to crush the people that challenge that? Well, they're bringing in a foreign force, right? Which inherently is challenging, you would think, Ethiopia's sovereignty. From the U.S. perspective, initially the U.S. had greenlit this conflict. Ethiopia has for a long time been a strategic linchpin in the region. It has been aligned with the West, certainly the United States, since 9/11. Even before that, but especially since 9/11. And I think, granted, we did change administrations from Trump to Biden, but I think a large degree for the reason why we see increased pressure from Blinken and the Biden administration is because the Ethiopian government, I think, I think they lied to the United States and other forces about what really this operation was going to be, which is not. I'm not justifying anything that the U.S. was doing, but I'm just saying that even amongst themselves, even amongst people who had agreed upon this really inhuman act from the very beginning, there has not been a sort of alignment and a consensus around what's going on. In December, Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN Secretary General, had even said, that we know, because Abiy Ahmed told me that there are no Eritrean troops in Tigray. And we find out in March, when Abiy is now admitting to the world, there are Eritrean troops in Tigray. And soon after, he's like, oh yeah, they'll leave. we don't know what's happening, right? They still are there. In fact, they're saying that they're in Oromia. We don't even know exactly the scale to which the Eritrean forces are in there. And that opens up a whole other issue, because within Eritrea, again, as I mentioned, as an authoritarian, as a dictatorial state that it is, like, there's forced conscription. And so there's just a whole lot of issues that are going on there. So ultimately, I think what we can say is that we can't trust these governments which are waging war, and will go through any lengths to use disinformation to be able to communicate what they need to communicate to win the hearts and minds of people in the international community. But they're certainly not winning the hearts and minds of the international community because, again, the scale of destruction cannot be disputed. As Fatuma mentioned, there's been a comms blackout for months. Asmarom before was speaking about the degree to which famine is crippling the Tigray region. And certainly now when we're thinking about like farming seasons up to, right now we know for certain 400,000 people are at risk of famine, and it's probably even higher than that. Even before the war in Tigray, Ethiopia had major issues with internally displaced people. And now there are roughly 2 million people who are internally displaced from the Tigray conflict. And that's not even including other internally displaced people from, some of the communal violence that had been spoken about before. So this is a very serious situation. Honestly, like, to even speak to the degrees of which sexual violence is happening, I don't even think we can't, it's not even a space to be able to speak to that. Like, I don't even know how to begin to address that, but it's an incredibly brutal conflict. And even just a couple of weeks ago, 3 Doctors Without Borders workers were murdered in Tigray. And so, some of the calls that we're hearing are for, again, ending comms blackouts, allowing for humanitarian corridors to be fully open, and ensuring aid can be reaching regions which are hard hit and certainly beset by famine-like conditions, and as well allowing for investigations to happen, independent investigations to happen throughout Tigray, but also through other parts of Ethiopia. So that's just sort of like a quick sort of like trying to close things up a little bit. Again, if folks have questions, please, you can unmute your mics, put them in the chat. Asmarom, Fatuma, like, anything else you want to add about, again, what's going on right now, and also how people in Westchester, people in New York can be active in what's going on?
I'd like to add that this war is no longer just between, the TPLF elite and the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments and their allies. This is really a war between the people of Tigray and the people who want to subjugate Tigray. Many members of what we call the Tigray Defense Forces are not actually members of the TPLF. For example, the general who led the massive counter offensive that has crippled the Ethiopian army over the last couple of weeks, he left the TPLF 20 years ago. Me, myself, as a Tigrayan, I'm not very fond of the TPLF, but many members of the people who've joined the armed struggle have had their reservations about the TPLF, but they recognize that this conflict is something bigger. This conflict is about the war on women's bodies. This conflict is about the destruction of cultural heritage sites. So I just want everyone to know that this is not just between, political elite that, had power for 27 years, but this is just against the people of Tigray. And that's why we're prevailing now. I mean, the humanitarian situation is still bad. But that's what I need people to understand.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think most different, these ethno-linguistic societies and communities are kind of, losing faith in, even, the continuation of Ethiopia itself. As an Oromo, most Oromo youth now have given up on, nonviolent means of resistance and are joining armed struggles. And in Tigray, as Marom has said, all sectors of Tigrayan society has joined the resistance, even those who are not very friendly with the TPLF, because it is a matter of existence, right? Like, it's the continuation of you as a people. And, that's how a lot of people, when you talk to, especially us in the diaspora, we advocate, but those on the ground say it is really a matter of them continuing as a people. So they have no choice but to fight back when they see, their sisters, their mothers being raped and brutalized, and homes being burnt and historical sites destroyed. That is an attack on your identity as a people. And so various parts of Ethiopia are experiencing this. It is, the scale in Tigray is obviously much, much worse than in other parts. In Oromia, it's getting really bad. But what I would suggest that people do is just stay very well informed about who the actors are, because a lot can be confused in the international coverage or in the discourse. Equalizing who's the aggressor and who is the aggrieved. In wars, a lot of grays can exist, a lot of discourse and framing is out there. So, I would just mostly ask people to stay as informed as possible and follow different sites. For Oromos, there's Oromo Protest Headquarters. There are Oromo activists for Tigray. There's Omna Tigray. There's Tigray youth associations. Other than that, push for, as Andom said, for the Ethiopian government to open humanitarian corridors so people can get help, right? And or you can write your representatives and your senators or call, because Ethiopia is an aid-dependent country, and a lot of what they're able to do in repressing their citizens is being funded and aided by foreign aid. And so a lot of times when we advocate and tag the State Department or and the Foreign Affairs Committee, it looks like people are asking for the United States to come in and change the regime, but it's really about using their leverage to for this regime to course correct, right? Because it's an aid-dependent country. It is not capable of waging wars on so many different fronts on their citizens without the aid that comes in from foreign powers. And so these foreign powers do have a lot of leverage and can influence the government to course correct. And so what people in the United States can do is really reach out to your representatives, reach out to your senators, and stay well informed as to where you can be more effective. But I think for the most part, staying informed, following the discourse, following the development of this war, and also making sure that you know where you can be most effective and just following through with that.
Thank you so much. No, I think that's really well said. I'd also like to add that, I think sometimes, certainly within Eritrea, because it's such a small country, whenever we have non-Eritreans and certainly non-Africans recognize that there's something that is challenging and a struggle for the people there, like it just empowers and motivates us so much. And we see that other people hear the cries that very often just go silent throughout the international community. And certainly, at least recently and more, we're hearing more about what's happening in Tigray, but again, not as much as being said about it as it should be, considering how serious the crisis is, as Asmoran was saying, right? Yemen and Tigray are certainly the two most dire humanitarian crises in the world, and they very, very rarely get attention. And so as Fatima was saying, considering the ways in which, again, most people are not asking for, military intervention from the US. They're recognizing that diplomatic pressure is real and can be effective. And certainly when, I just put in the chat, right, like just recently, Italy and France signed like 2 new military deals with Ethiopia. Like what are we talking about? And how is that even possible right now in this time? I know Laura mentioned before around like Egypt, we don't even have the time to talk about the dam and Egypt, Sudan, and the Nile River and the issues that are going on there, and how that's, from the US perspective, like can be challenging because Egypt and Ethiopia have long been really their two strongest allies on the African continent for decades. So diplomatic pressure can be effective, and that only happens again when people mobilize. But even if that is not look, even if that's not going to do anything, I think it means a lot to I don't want to speak for Ethiopians, but I think it means something to Ethiopians. Certainly as an Eritrean, when I hear, people speak about what's going on in Eritrea, I'm like, oh wait, you've heard of Eritrea? Like, I'm even surprised you even heard of it. So yeah, I don't know, Asmaro, if there's anything you wanted to